The mass media, an infinite source of content that has grown exponentially over the course of time, informing and influencing those who consume it. In the early 1960s, the Beach Boys' hit, Surfin' Safari, climbed to the top of the charts, and Johnny Carson's Tonight Show debuted only 1 week before the opening of one of the most influential events of the decade, the Second Vatican Council.
Vatican II was the first great broadcast story in the history of the Catholic Church, where it was really TV and radio that brought that event home. The color, the sound, the feel, the smell, the taste of it, brought it home to the entire world. And Vatican Radio was right there doing its thing.
For the first time in history, radio and television began to cover international news involving the Church, while listeners and viewers of the 60s were becoming accustomed to a life surrounded by an influx of media depicting both positive and negative, the good and the evil.
If Vatican II is a call to the lay people, the role, the hour of the laity, it is also the role and the responsibility of the laity to demand beauty in this day and age, to surround itself with beauty.
Join us as we meet with historians and theologians, eyewitnesses and experts to investigate the meaning of Vatican II and uncover the event which would become a definitive landmark in the history of the modern Catholic Church. The 1960s brought about a series of major innovations and discoveries, altering the ways in which information was communicated. Acknowledging the evolving technologies of the time, the bishops of Vatican II sought to discuss the media of social communications, examining the press. Along with film, radio, television, and art, the bishops would focus on 3 major topics: the universality of the story of Christianity, the responsibilities of artists and patrons, and a beauty that saves. Throughout the history of the Church, one of the most common ways of communicating the story of salvation has been through works of art.
And how many different ways in 2,000 years have we managed to represent transcendence? Whether it's a Byzantine icon, whether it's Michelangelo's creation of man, whether it's a Bernini, whether it's a Caravaggio with a slice of light that suddenly erupts in the darkness. All these different ways that we have managed to represent transcendence.
But years later, the modes of communication have radically changed. In an age brimming with smartphones, tablets, and social media, it's difficult to imagine a world without. Each second, more than 500,000 posts are shared on Facebook, 2 days of video are uploaded to YouTube, and 100,000 messages are simultaneously cast into the Twitter sphere. Today, one can also read daily updates from Pope Francis at the flick of a finger. But 50 years ago, the bishops of Vatican II were just starting to grapple with a new interest from television and radio news outlets.
The Vatican had a press office that was supposed to sort of work with the media. They weren't really prepared for the enormity of the modern media and its insatiable, hunger to get the story.
Vatican II, from a media point of view, really created an entire industry, what the Italians call the Vaticanisti, meaning, full-time professional Vatican correspondents. But, of course, the council wasn't just of interest to Catholic insiders. I mean, it was a massive world story for the 4 years from 1962 to 1965 that it took place.
Many people speak of the Second Vatican Council as the first really modern ecumenical council, because you don't just have representatives from the print media there. They would have, to some extent, covered certain elements of, say, Vatican I. But of course, you got radio and you even have television media.
And it really was, I think, a shock to the Catholic system in many ways that these sort of somewhat arcane theological conversations among experts suddenly were showing up on the front page of major daily newspapers and were being talked about on AM talk radio in the States and in other parts of the world.
We're much more sophisticated today than we were then. I mean, we have, I think, trained people in communications who are working in the Vatican to try and work with the press. But at that time, the Vatican was very inexperienced at that kind of thing. And so it's an interesting story to see how journalists were covering those events.
I think at one level, that was a very healthy experience for the church, because it was a sort of new realization that what we're doing matters, and it matters not just to us, but it matters to the outside world looking in on us. And that impressions of what Catholicism is about are now being created in a way that is reaching everyone on the planet. That was all very positive. On the other hand, I think it also created a little bit of sort of nervousness and fear and trembling inside the system, because all of a sudden all these media outlets that officialdom can't control are shaping the conversation about the church. And so rather than dictating the terms of that conversation, now we're merely one player among many. And that changes the dynamics. And I think that transition from the church as the sort of controlling authoritative oracle on all matters Catholic to the church as a participant in a global conversation that's sort of a level media playing field is still in process.
I was in the seminary at Dunwoody all through the council, and every day it was like a theology from the New York Times, because the Times would report the goings-on almost every day, and we'd have different professors coming in, explaining the events of that day or that week, and giving various views as to the significance of those interventions at the council.
While the international press descended upon Rome, the bishops themselves were inside the aula discussing the mass media, its implications for the church and modern society. They set to work on a document that would address such media, encompassing works of art, news, and original programming for television, print, and radio. Their aim? To assess how to entertain, educate, enlighten, and evangelize the world.
Education will be very important, and education with a particular eye to taking back what is ours. The history of Christian art is a history of evangelization through images, with some of the greatest, the equivalent of the most effective PR studios or the most effective ad agencies is what the church has had all these years as we used art to evangelize.
Being surrounded by so much media attention, the bishops first took special care to address the form of news communications, emphasizing their need to be truthful and complete within the bounds of justice and charity, encompassing a manner that could be considered proper and decent with respect for morality and dignity of the human person.
To me, the fidelity that counts as a journalist is fidelity to the principles of good journalistic tradecraft, which means balance, and it means objectivity, and it means listening to all the voices, and it means trying to get the story right. And my conviction as a Catholic is that if in the main I'm able to live up to those lofty ideals, at the end of the day, even though the reality of the church is always going to be a mixed bag, at the end of the day, telling a faithful, objective, balanced, inclusive, and accurate story about the church is going to help.
As the Council Fathers continued formulating their document, which would come to be known as Inter Mirifica, or Among the Wonders, they discussed the duty of pastors to guide their faithful in striving to instill a both human and Christian spirit in the media.
So it was quite an education to be going through formation during the time of the council. And I think we were well prepared when the council was finished to respond to questions, to help clarify confusions. And I think we were much the richer for it.
Another point I make with my students, I draw upon the great Protestant theologian Karl Barth, who said it was important for the preacher, but then I extend it to all of us, to read with the Bible in one hand and the daily newspaper in the other. And so to see the cross-fertilization, what does the light of Scripture have to say to the events of today?
Since the 1860s, the newspaper LOsservatore Romano has been covering Vatican affairs.
The revolution that has happened at LOsservatore Romano under the current editor, an Italian layman by the name of Gian Maria Vian, is nothing short of historic. I mean, in the arc of time that I've been covering the Vatican, when I got here in the 1990s, people looked at LOsservatore Romano the way they looked at Pravda in the Soviet Union. You know, you would kind of read the tea leaves for, what's going on in officialdom. But you certainly didn't expect to be entertained, or you didn't expect to be provoked by it. Whereas under Vian, it has become a really lively journalistic product. Now, and that's not without its risks, because every time LOsservatore Romano publishes something about women in the church, or the state of ecumenism, or at a sort of dumber level. I mean, their essays on, say, The Simpsons or Michael Jackson or the Beatles. Some people are going to think this is somehow an official Vatican statement, and so they know they're playing with fire. But on the other hand, they also know there is a market out there for thoughtful, open, honest Catholic reflection on the vicissitudes of the church, and I think they've made enormous strides in trying to feed that appetite.
Mirifica urged that Catholic newspapers, press, and production companies be founded and fostered, promoting positive, grounded content.
I would say that in the same way that Vatican I was the sort of coming out party for LOsservatore Romano, Vatican II was the introduction to the wider world for Vatican Radio.
Though Vatican Radio was originally born in the 1930s, it wasn't until the Second Vatican Council that it rose to international renown. Today, Radio Vaticana is broadcast in 47 languages throughout 61 countries around the world.
Vatican Radio, of course, was founded by Pope Pius XI in the early 20th century. Actually, Marconi, an Italian who was one of the pioneers of radio, was its chief engineer and technician in the early days. Vatican Radio bills itself as the voice of the Pope, and that's the role it's tried to play over the years. And Vatican II was crucial because it really was the first broadcast story in the history of the Catholic Church. I mean, prior to Vatican II, all of the major turning points in church history, from the Protestant Reformation and the Council of Trent to the First Vatican Council, these were all basically print stories that were told to the world by newspapers. So you got the text, but not the context.
But Vatican Radio, unlike the press, could instantaneously broadcast the story of the Second Vatican Council across oceans and continents, allowing it to unfold in the homes of listeners around the world. Still, the inside story, what was being discussed on the council floor, was not so easy for reporters to scoop.
Initially, all of the bishops were sworn to secrecy. They were not allowed to say anything about what transpired during the general congregations when the council was in session. Well, of course, that was just a recipe for endless gossip and so on and so forth. And of course, the way the Vatican press office tried to deal with it is they said, look, we'll give you a press release that'll summarize what happened during the day.
But some journalists just weren't satisfied with the Vatican's sparse briefings.
Well, Xavier Wren, who was a pen name for an American theologian who wrote very, very popular essays and dispatches about the council that were published in leading American magazines, is sort of the prototypical Vaticanista. And by the way, as a point of American pride, I like to remind my Italian colleagues that you guys didn't invent the Vaticanisti, we did. You simply monopolized it in the years after the council.
You still had a problem that the media were not able to actually be present during the general congregations, right? Which was a real problem for them. Now, some of them had ingenious ways of getting around it. So, for example, there was an American journalist named Paul Brindell. And he clearly had some kind of inside scoop because his articles were revealing very detailed excerpts from speeches that were given at the council. And the journalists were all trying to figure out who Brindell's sources were. And nobody really had the answer until they looked at one of the Italian newspapers one day, which had a picture of the liturgy that was celebrated that morning, when there was a choir of seminarians all dressed in cassocks that were singing at the liturgy at the beginning of the session. And they noticed there was the journalist, Paul Brindell, who had put on a cassock and surplice to go sing at the liturgy and then managed to linger afterwards and so got the inside scoop in the council.
Father Francis X. Murphy is somewhat of a journalistic legend of Vatican II, who was present at the council. Author of the widely popular New Yorker magazine's Letter from Vatican City, he was the one publishing under the pseudonym Xavier Wren. At the time, no one knew that Wren also happened to be a Redemptorist chaplain and a professor at the Pontifical Lateran University.
And Xavier Wren, in that sense, is sort of prototypical for a whole new way of talking about the Catholic Church. I mean, prior to Vatican II, and in particular prior to Xavier Wren, I mean, what you had in terms of literature that was accessible to people about the Church was either the official documents that the Church itself would produce, or it was very sober, formal dispatches, and very infrequently produced, say, in the New York Times or Le Monde or the London Guardian. But Ren introduced verve and elan and style and panache in the way he would talk about very arcane things, like, competing Jesuit and Dominican views of grace. But I mean, he would do it in a way that would make those concepts not only accessible, but relevant and actually mesmerizing for a mass audience. I mean, in other words, what Xavier Ren illustrated is that if you build it, they will come. If you can find a way to talk about religious topics in a gripping way in the public square, you will find an audience.
Recognizing the importance of the media as a mode of evangelization, the bishops of Vatican II encouraged Catholic networks and stations to hold the highest standards in production and content. They called on priests, religious, and lay people to employ technical and artistic skill in production, along with a strong moral grounding. Although the Church still remains on this path today, the landscape is shifting.
The world of communications is changing enormously. A lot of people are saying that big numbers of newspapers their very existence is under threat. Fewer people are reading newspapers, probably fewer are listening to the radio. More and more people are using the internet and television, although that is often difficult and expensive. But we can't afford to have our means of communication in the church a bit like dinosaurs, adapted and very suitable for an age which is passing.
How can the Church then reach its audience today?
Basically through the media, because everybody's using the internet and Facebook and so on. And also I think that we can use the Catholic youths as young people to go out and just to evangelize, or to just live a Catholic life. I mean, it gives so much hope. As for me as a Catholic, when I see someone else, another young person who lives that faith. So basically the media and through young people, for young people.
The two greatest uses of the internet are for pornography and religion. It shows people are searching in the privacy of their homes. They're often trying to find out what religion has to offer. And it's easier to do that privately than to step up in front of a crowd or a group or even in front of your friends. So the pressures against us have increased enormously. The forces, the evil one who is organizing the sowing of the weeds amongst the wheat can do it much more efficiently than in the past, but so can we.
The doctrines of the church are perennial. They're never changing. But we need to repackage, so to speak, and present the same good news in new ways that will make it attractive and intelligible to the people of our times. So we talk about using an updated language, for example, the language of today, the language of the social means of communication, the language of cultural diversity that will enable a modern day man or woman to be able to receive the good news and understand what it means to them.
The bishops emphasized the role of the faithful in bearing witness through social communications, but also noted the harm done to society by evil use and exploitation of the media. In light of discussions on the council floor, it was agreed that artistic, technical, political, and economic ambitions should never oppose the common good, and that patrons should be aware of the great responsibility that they hold.
One of the things that is important about art that does not change is that art was market-driven in the Renaissance. When we created really good art, it was because there was a patron. There was someone who said, I'm going to buy this, I'm not going to buy that. The church is no longer in a position to hold that role as patron in that sense. The church is still the paternal guide should artists want to listen to her, should artists want to measure itself against her great tradition. But the people who actually are the patrons today of art are us. We are the ones who they're always trying to get our buying power into the cinema, our buying power into the blockbuster show. And when we withhold it, it tells people this is not marketable. When we give it, it means this is something we like. We hold a lot more power in this story should we choose to exercise it, or if we're just going to continue to just look at things and say, ha ha ha, it's really kind of funny, or it doesn't really matter, or it's just entertainment, or it's just, if you're going to do that, you are going to continue to get bad art and you will never be able to promote good art.
Franklin McMahon was one of the journalists present for the Second Vatican Council, but his role as a reporter was unique. He delivered his stories through a series of drawings and paintings which captured the council. To work in the mass media, it is key for producers, reporters, and artists to be aware of the nature of that which they are communicating, the circumstances, and the manner in which their media achieves effect. The Council Fathers found this to be particularly important in cultivating a transparent sense of media literacy, particularly in the field of news reporting.
The Vatican is not nearly as much of a closed shop or, hostile to the media, impossible to penetrate, as popular stereotypes would suggest. I mean, I'll tell you, the real problem with covering the Vatican is not secrecy, it's singularity. The Vatican is simply utterly unique. It is completely unlike other institutions most people will have encountered in the course of their lives. You can't just roll off from covering City Hall and think you're going to make sense of the Vatican in 3 or 4 days, which is how a lot of people try to do this job. But if you can crack the codes, that is, if you can learn some Italian, if you can learn the language of the Catholic Church, and you can learn the thought world of the Roman Curia, which is the central bureaucracy of the Church, if you can sort of master those 3 foreign tongues, then there's very little about the Vatican you can't actually figure out. In my experiences, nobody's going to get in the way if you're trying to do that. My own read would be that the people who are formally in charge of Vatican communications generally do a marvelous job. I mean, people like Father Federico Lombardi, the Jesuit, who is the head of the Vatican press office, is one of the most savvy and sensitive and articulate and thoughtful spokespersons for the Church you're ever going to find. And of course, as an American, I think they made a great move in bringing the veteran Fox News and Time Magazine correspondent Greg Burke on board to be a kind of behind-the-scenes guru in terms of messaging. These guys get it, but the problem is that there are a lot of other people bumping around the system who will occasionally pop off and sort of distract from what the message that they're trying to broadcast actually is.
Mirifica would also take into account the rights of art. While depictions, descriptions, and portrayals of evil can at times serve the purpose of a deeper understanding of humanity, the Council Fathers reminded the faithful that morality affects all spheres of human affairs, and in Christianity, media should never be used to cause harm or influence destructive desires.
Another big problem in our modern artistic world is our willingness to accept this desecration of our imagery, whether it be in the fine arts, when you see shows like Saatchi's show on sensations, whether you see pop singers sort of dressing up or making fun of what are our most iconic images, whether you see in cinema a kind of travesty of that which we have spent many years representing as transcendent, and we pay for it. We go to the show, we pay the ticket, we buy the songs, we go to the movie, and we pay for it.
The bishops called the faithful to turn to media that reflects its true value, so as not to lead others away from truth, goodness, and beauty.
We look through the ugliness to beauty. These are all things that the Council tries to reiterate, but we don't seem to have fully absorbed. We have been looking for 1,700 years at the image of a man lying dead, or dead on a cross, or on a cross later on, dead on a cross. But when Velázquez paints us the image of the lifeless Christ, even though we see the bloodied body, we see the bowed head, he gives us through that luminous body, that understanding that through this we see eternity, we see the divine vision, we have the beatific vision ahead of us. Even Salvador Dali succeeded in his very haunting, sort of floating cross to give us a sense of being lifted up out of this moment.
Patrons of art, including consumers of news and media, bear a shared responsibility to seek out quality sources of information and entertainment while helping to inform public opinion.
Perhaps the medium that has inspired the truly creative has been cinema. The art forms that used to fill chapels and used to cover the nave of churches have now been supplanted by film. And so what we do get occasionally is a great Christian film, a great film that tells an epic story.
Education in sacred art has been a long-lasting pillar of the Catholic tradition, but courses in broadcast and digital media are being established to continue the mission of the Council Fathers in the revival of Catholic social communications. The Pontifical University of Santa Croce is one such institute that offers formal training and degrees in media. And even more recently, the Vatican has inaugurated efforts in media, art, and culture, such as World Communications Day, the 2013 TEDx Conference on Religious Freedom, and the Via Pulchritudinis, or the Way of Beauty initiative.
It's kind of exciting to see how many programs are starting right now. So ever since the foundation of this, the Via Pulchritudinis, this initiative in 2006 to really have this evangelization through beauty, we find a lot more interest in having summer classes or seminarian classes that, try to approach evangelization through beauty. That's actually, I think, one of the great unsung gifts of this pontificate, is that Benedict XVI truly, looking at everything that Paul VI tried to do when he met with the artists in the Sistine Chapel in 1964, and John Paul II meets with the artists in the year 2000 in Sistine Chapel, and then Benedict XVI meets with them in 2006. He opens up the way of beauty and really says, all he's asking is, let's try to make things beautiful again, because the story of our salvation is beautiful. And beauty, it can save. Beauty can uplift. Beauty, as he says so beautifully, it wounds. And as that little vulnera, that little opening, beauty creates that little opening, and that's where the Holy Spirit can get in.
Mindful of the many young eyes and ears open to the world, Mirifica reminds all those involved in production and distribution of their accountability for the messages they broadcast. The Council Fathers also encouraged the practice of moderation and self-control in consuming media. While some argue about the direction that post-Vatican II art and media took, the faithful are reminded that the heart of the message starts in their homes.
The spirit of Vatican II and this awakening of the lay people, why is it that the lay people sort of sit around and sort of look at the churches and say, I don't like what's in my church, but on the other hand, where are artists going to show their work if not in churches? We don't have side chapels anymore. We don't need these special side chapels for families to have their separate masses said, so we don't have that kind of outlet. And then when people want works of art in their houses, nobody seems to want a Christ crowned with thorns anymore. Nobody seems to want an Annunciation. Nobody wants a Holy Family anymore. You want something that's properly feng shui, that will go with this goes with my living room, this goes with my mood, I'd like some flowers. If we don't want sacred art in our homes, around our lives every single day, how can we possibly be capable of judging it or understanding it or approaching it in the space of our church where we go once a week?
In the current flood of information, the faithful often experience an even greater need for peace and contemplation. By turning to a focal point, such as a crucifix or religious art in the home, Christians can find a more grounded sense of serenity and strength. Mirifica was the first decree to be promulgated by the Second Vatican Council, but its effects are lasting and even more relevant today, inspiring a number of other subsequent documents on the arts and communications, such as Communio et Progresso, John Paul II's Letter to Artists, Aetatis Novae, and Rapido Sviluppo. Mirifica stands at the heart of a church reaching out to the modern world. As Vatican II drew to an end, how would the bishops look at Christ's presence in the diocese and parish? Join us next time on Vatican II, Inside the Council.